I never thought I'd walk into my own backyard and feel like I'd stumbled onto the set of a reality show gone horribly wrong. But there I was, standing frozen, tray of iced tea in hand, staring at a man mid-cannonball into my koi pond. He wore blindingly bright neon swim trunks and a grin so wide you'd think he'd just won the lottery. The splash was massive, water exploding over my carefully trimmed garden, soaking the patio and drenching me head to toe. But that was just the beginning. 2 kids I didn't recognize, each floating lazily on inflatable flamingos, paddled around the pond as if they owned it. A family was setting up a full-blown barbecue near my shed. I could smell the lighter fluid and hear the sizzle of burger patties hitting a hot grill. A teenager blasted obnoxious pop music from a portable speaker, the bass thudding against my chest with every beat. My private retreat had transformed into a public beach party overnight, and I hadn't received so much as a knock on the door. I wanted to shout, to demand answers, but before I could form a single word, my eyes landed on her. Karen. The self-declared queen of our HOA, lounging on my favorite deck chair like it belonged to her, oversized sunglasses perched on her nose, sipping something pink through a ridiculous bendy straw. She tilted her head slightly, giving me a smug little wave. "Lovely day for a swim, isn't it?" she called out, her voice sugary sweet and dripping with condescension. Just 2 weeks ago, my backyard had been my sanctuary. I'd spent years building it, the pond lined with smooth river rocks, lilies floating like little pieces of art, koi gliding beneath the surface in perfect harmony. Quackers, my loyal duck friend, visited every morning, waddling to the pond's edge for a slice of bread. The gentle rustling of reeds and the croak of frogs had been my daily soundtrack. But now, thanks to Karen, it was all chaos. And then I saw it, a bright laminated sign hanging crookedly from what used to be my fence, "Community Pond, open to all VIP access available." My jaw clenched. She wasn't just turning my backyard into a public pool, she was making money off it. The days that followed felt like living in someone else's nightmare. Each morning, I woke to the sound of shrieking kids, blaring music, and the constant slap of water as strangers turned my once serene pond into their personal splash zone. My koi fish darted nervously from shadow to shadow, their peaceful gliding replaced with frantic bursts of movement as feet and floaties churned their home into a mess. Empty soda cans floated by the lilies. Someone left a half-eaten hot dog on one of the rocks. I found chip bags tangled in my pond reeds, and the garden I had painstakingly cultivated was steadily getting trampled into muddy patches. But the worst moment came one quiet evening when I realized Quackers hadn't shown up. At first, I thought maybe he was avoiding the noise like I was. But after 2 days of absence, I knew something was wrong. I went straight to Karen's front door, heart pounding, my anger barely restrained. She answered in a silk robe, wine glass in hand, not a care in the world. When I asked if she'd seen Quackers, her expression shifted into something resembling mock concern. "Oh? That noisy bird? Animal control might have picked it up. It was disrupting my book club last week." Her smile was pure venom. She didn't even try to hide it. I walked home seething, my fists clenched so tight my palms ached. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just Karen being controlling, it was personal. She wanted to break me. But if she thought I'd roll over, she didn't know me at all. The next morning, I stepped outside and nearly lost it. My entire fence was gone. Not just a panel or two. The entire thing, posts, panels, and all, ripped out. In its place stood a temporary rope barrier with laminated signs every few feet reading, "Community Recreation Area, no restrictions." My property line, privacy, and peace of mind had been erased overnight. And if that wasn't enough, a letter arrived from the HOA that afternoon. 3 separate violation notices, one for excessive noise originating from backyard gatherings, another for failure to maintain proper sanitation, and the last, the one that nearly made me laugh in disbelief, for harboring aggressive wildlife. Frogs and ducks, apparently, were now classified as threats under HOA Bylaw 9b. I knew exactly who was behind it. Karen had found new ways to twist the knife. I sat on my deck that night, the sounds of strangers laughing and splashing just yards away, and decided I wasn't going to let her win. The plan came to me the next morning. It was simple, petty, and perfect. I drove out to the farm supply store and returned with crates of frogs. Not just a few. Dozens. That night, under the cover of darkness, I released them into the pond. They scattered quickly, slipping beneath the water, climbing onto lily pads, and settling along the edges. Their croaks rose into a chorus that echoed into the night, loud, messy, unstoppable. The next day was pure magic. Kids screamed as frogs leapt onto their floaties. Parents frantically dragged them out of the water. One boy slipped and fell, letting out a wail loud enough to echo down the block. Doug, the cannonball king himself, tried to ignore the chaos until a large frog landed right on his shoulder, sending him stumbling backward into the barbecue pit. Karen appeared on my deck in full panic mode, her expression a perfect blend of outrage and horror. I sipped my coffee and smiled. Game on. The victory was sweet but short-lived. By the following morning, I woke to the sound of trucks idling outside my house and the heavy clank of equipment being unloaded. I rushed to the back deck and felt my stomach drop. A full cleaning crew had descended on my backyard like locusts, armed with hoses, chemical sprays, and nets. They moved methodically, scooping up frogs and dumping them into large plastic bins like garbage. My lilies were crushed under muddy boots, and the smooth stones around my pond were being scrubbed so hard it looked like they'd been sandblasted. At the center of it all stood Karen, clipboard in hand, barking orders like a general preparing for battle. I stormed down the steps. "What the hell are you doing?" I demanded. She didn't even flinch. "Fixing your mess, Mason. The HOA has generously covered the cost of cleaning this health hazard." She gestured dismissively toward the pond, which now resembled a construction site. "Frogs carry bacteria, you know. We can't have children exposed to that." I was so furious I could barely speak, but then something caught my eye. One of the workers was unloading a large, pristine outdoor deck set from the back of the same truck. Brand new. Still wrapped in plastic. And when they finished hauling it out, they carried it straight across the street and set it up on Karen's patio. My blood boiled. The chemical smell in my backyard lingered long after they left. My pond, once full of life, sat sterile and eerily still. The frogs were gone. My koi hovered nervously in one corner, and the reeds I'd nurtured for years had been trampled to mush. But if Karen thought that was going to stop me, she didn't know how stubborn I could be. The next morning, I made some calls. By afternoon, I had a truckload of ducks, 15 of them, noisy, flapping, waddling, and exactly what I needed. Some were big and lazy, others small and energetic, but they all had one thing in common: they were loud. As I released them into the pond, they wasted no time claiming their new kingdom, paddling in tight circles, flapping their wings, and quacking like they were hosting their own loud convention. Karen's outrage didn't take long to arrive. That afternoon, she stomped into my backyard, dressed in her HOA-branded polo, her face a shade of red that almost matched the color of her lipstick. "What is this?" she shrieked. "Nature," I answered smoothly, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "Ducks are excellent for controlling algae and pests. I'm just doing my part for the environment." She spun on her heel and stormed off, muttering about bylaws. But I knew she couldn't touch me, not yet. Her grand HOA barbecue arrived that weekend, and Karen was determined to turn it into a public spectacle. People flooded into my yard with folding chairs, coolers, and picnic baskets, following Karen's directions like loyal subjects. The ducks were excitable, sensing the energy, flapping and quacking louder than ever. But I had one more surprise in store. Earlier that week, I'd noticed frog eggs nestled safely in the reeds before the chemical crew arrived. I'd hoped they'd hatch in time, and they did, right in the middle of Karen's precious event. At first, no one noticed the tiny froglets hopping along the water's edge. But then a little boy shrieked when one landed on his hot dog bun. Another froglet jumped into someone's open soda can. Within minutes, they were everywhere, leaping into coolers, onto folding chairs, and across people's laps. The ducks, startled by the sudden commotion, began flapping wildly, chasing the frogs and adding to the pandemonium. Plates of food flew through the air. A woman tripped over a lawn chair, sending a bowl of potato salad skyward. Children ran screaming from the pond as if it were on fire. And there, at the center of it all, stood Karen, frozen in horror, her white polo now smeared with barbecue sauce, her hair frizzing in the summer humidity, watching her grand event dissolve into chaos. I stood on my deck, sipping lemonade, barely able to suppress a grin. Karen caught sight of me and screeched, "You think this is funny?" "Oh, I think it's fantastic," I said, raising my glass. The fallout from Karen's ruined barbecue came fast and ugly. By Monday morning, I found a thick envelope stuffed into my mailbox, an official notice from the HOA, demanding that I pay for half the cost of what they called emergency pond sanitization and public safety restoration. The invoice was laughable if it weren't so infuriating: $2,500 for specialized frog removal services, $800 for chemical aquatic sanitation, and a suspicious $1,200 for community relaxation furnishings, which I had already seen set up proudly on Karen's patio. I tore the letter in half and tossed it straight into the trash. I wasn't going to pay a dime for Karen's schemes. But the real storm was still brewing. That afternoon, I spotted Karen strutting around the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, stopping at doorsteps and whispering to neighbors like a politician on a campaign trail. Every time she glanced my way, her smile twisted into something cruel. I could only imagine the lies she was feeding everyone, probably painting me as some unhinged recluse sabotaging community events and endangering the neighborhood with dangerous wildlife. Sure enough, 2 days later, an emergency HOA meeting notice was posted on every community bulletin board and sent by email. Mandatory attendance. I didn't want to go. The idea of sitting in a room while Karen spun her web of lies made my blood boil, but I knew I couldn't let her narrative become the truth. The meeting was packed, the clubhouse buzzing with murmurs and side conversations that quieted as soon as Karen took her place at the front. She stood tall, that same smug posture, clipboard clutched like a royal scepter. She opened with a deep, dramatic sigh. "Friends and neighbors, I wish I didn't have to bring this to your attention, but our community is under threat." Her voice quivered with practiced concern. She clicked a remote, and blurry photos projected onto the wall: frogs clinging to picnic tables, ducks waddling through crowds, children fleeing the pond. "Mason's backyard," she continued, "has become a public health and safety hazard. He has deliberately introduced invasive species, sabotaged our events, and disregarded community harmony. I understand he's upset, but personal frustration cannot come before the well-being of all residents." There were nods in the crowd. I could feel the tide turning against me. She was good, too good. But she made one mistake. She gave me the microphone. I stood slowly, feeling every eye in the room on me. I took out my phone, my heart pounding but steady. "I'd like to show everyone something," I said, tapping the screen. The projector flickered to life, this time displaying crystal-clear footage from the wildlife camera I'd hidden near my pond. The room fell silent as video clips played, Karen's hired crew trampling my garden, dumping chemical solutions into the water, scooping up frogs and stuffing them into bins like garbage. The next clip showed her teenage nephew, spray painting the rocks around the pond and laughing while Karen watched from the patio, wine glass in hand. Gasps rippled through the room. I looked around at the faces, shock, anger, and disbelief replacing the earlier skepticism. Karen's face paled, her lips tightening. I continued calmly. Karen violated multiple HOA bylaws, misused community funds for personal gain, and trespassed on private property. I have copies of the receipts, emails, and video evidence. A man in the back muttered, "She's been pulling this kind of thing for years." Another voice added, "I wondered where our HOA fees were going." The tide shifted so quickly Karen couldn't keep up. She tried to regain control, stammering, "These videos are taken out of context." But nobody was buying it anymore. The room had turned on her. The HOA board president cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "We will be launching a full investigation into these allegations. Until then, Karen, all HOA spending authority is suspended." Karen's expression collapsed into something between fury and panic. She tried to speak but ended up choking on her own indignation. She grabbed her clipboard like a lifeline and stormed out of the room, knocking over a folding chair in her retreat. I sat back down, finally allowing myself a breath. The room buzzed with whispered conversations, heads shaking in disbelief. For the first time, Karen wasn't in control. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I'd won a battle worth fighting. I thought the war was over, but Karen wasn't done yet. A week after the HOA meeting, I opened my door to find a city inspector standing on my porch, clipboard in hand, expression grim. He explained that a report had been filed claiming my pond was an unregulated wetland and a potential environmental hazard. If confirmed, I could be forced to drain it and face hefty fines. I didn't need to ask who had filed the complaint. Karen's fingerprints were all over it. My stomach twisted as I led the inspector through the backyard that had once been my sanctuary. He took notes, measured distances, examined water runoff, and shook his head more than once. I could feel the weight of it, the possibility that after all this, I might lose the pond entirely. But then I remembered something. The wildlife rescue I'd worked with had mentioned that certain native frog species were protected under state law. I spent the next morning researching, diving into environmental regulations and native species protection lists until my eyes blurred. Then I made a call to the rescue organization and explained everything. By afternoon, they connected me with a local wildlife expert, Dr. Emily Brooks, who came out to my property and spent over an hour carefully examining the pond. When she finally turned to me with a smile and confirmed that multiple protected species had taken up residence in my pond, I knew the game had changed. I met with the city inspector again, this time armed with Dr. Brooks's official report. His entire tone shifted. Instead of violations, my pond was now legally classified as a protected habitat, untouchable. Karen's attempt to destroy me had backfired spectacularly. Not only could the HOA no longer claim my backyard as public property, but they were also forced to revoke every community pond designation. And the final blow came at the next HOA meeting, where Karen was officially voted out as president and ordered to repay the funds she had misused. In the weeks that followed, my pond returned to peace. The ducks claimed their territory with gusto, the frogs sang every evening, my koi glided calmly through the water, and, to my absolute joy, quackers waddled back, drawn home by familiar sounds and the promise of safety. My neighbors, once so eager to exploit my backyard, now kept their distance, casting nervous glances toward my fence as if worried I might unleash another wave of chaos if they crossed the line. One evening, with the sun dipping below the horizon and the water rippling in gold and purple, I sat on my deck with a cold drink in hand. Quackers settled beside me, and I couldn't resist hanging a new sign on my freshly rebuilt fence, Mason's Pond, wildlife only, entry by request. I knew Karen would see it. I knew she'd hate it. And that made it perfect. Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.